Okay, just the one slide I'm going to show you here, and you can refer to the notes as we go through this. We've had two presentations so far, one about what happened in the referendum, one about how economists got it wrong, and then beginning to think about what might be happening next. I really want to continue that theme, and really the thought for this was about EU policy competences, but also about policy considerations for Northern Ireland. It's clear in many ways that essentially we're going to look at the present, look at the future, things are moving very quickly. Again, last week, Theresa May talked about the idea of repealing the European Communities Act of 1972, bringing all those issues into EU law, into UK law, and then working out which ones to keep, which ones to actually leave. We're moving towards Article 50, and it is important, I think, to think about it's almost 4 months since that referendum took place. If we think about Theresa May and triggering Article 50 by the end of March at the latest, there's an issue of time here. Is time against us? We need to engage in terms of the coverage you're getting so far in terms of the UK. We need to work out, what is a British position? What does it look like in terms of the negotiations? Something else we haven't been hearing enough about in terms of where and what the negotiations might look like is, how do the other EU27 respond to all of this? It was hinted at the very beginning by Mike. Is it the Visegrad 4? Is it Malta? Are they game playing in terms of political grandstanding? Or are there real issues here? So there's an issue in terms of for the UK, but I want to leave the UK aside and begin to look at Northern Ireland and try and work out the challenges ahead and the opportunities. Now, I could keep you here for a long, long time as we go through all the various policies, but we can't actually do it. You'll be glad to know. But we've got to try and think about, we hear a lot about Brexit means Brexit, but that's a peg statement. What does it actually mean? What does it actually look like? And what does it mean here for Northern Ireland? And the question is, and there's a problem, I think, for Northern Ireland to start in terms of its size, in terms of how can she actually influence the UK position. We've had ministers over here in recent weeks, recent months, talking about, and certainly even David Cameron before he stepped down, Theresa May when she became Prime Minister, about the idea we want to engage with all the regions and nations of the United Kingdom. But what does this actually mean in practice? Is it telephone calls? Is it involvement? Is it influence? And I think for Northern Ireland, there are sort of three things to do. And this is where this timing element comes back in terms of we have 5 months to actually do something here, and in terms of those before Theresa May presses the trigger to start or invokes Article 50. What does Brexit mean for Northern Ireland in terms of policies? Is it in terms of access to the single market? Is it state aid? Is it services? Is it about liberalisation in general? Is it about energy? Is it about EU monies? Is it about universities in terms of grants coming in? Is it about students? Is it about fisheries? Structural funds? These are all the issues so I could keep you going for quite a while here, but won't. What are our priorities in each of these areas? The challenge again for the executive, for the assembly, and probably wider society as well is, but certainly in the first case of the executive, how does it help forge a British position? Who is it talking to in terms of the institutional structures? Is it with Whitehall? Is it with the devolved administrations? Are they finding areas where they agree? Or are there areas also where there are disagreement? And what do they do about those disagreements? And the real challenge is here, you can try and engage, but how do you influence that debate? And this is the issue again about Northern Ireland being a small entity, 3% of the UK population. Is there a danger? Is the danger actually out there that what could be Northern Ireland's interests could be trumped by wider UK interests in certain areas? So something to actually we need to be aware of as we try, or the UK government tries to work out a Northern Irish position, a British position, and where Northern Ireland actually lies within all of that. We also probably need to hear from wider society in Northern Ireland as well. We know there are certain groups, be they business groups, there's the voluntary sector, but there are also groups we need to hear about what are their priorities, how do they feed in to the discussions in the executive, how do they propel discussions forward, because they need to do so, and they need to do so urgently, because there's this real danger that somehow things are really going to move quickly, and are they prepared? In this presentation, we're going to divide into two policy areas, and we've tried to work out what are maybe the two of the most salient areas for Northern Ireland. And we're going to look at agriculture, which I'll spend 5 minutes on, and then my colleague Viviane is going to talk about the environment. You're all aware how important agriculture is for Northern Ireland in terms of money coming in terms of the workforce, which currently sits at some 48,000 people. You're aware that agriculture in terms of employment, in terms of GDP, is more important for this part of the world than it is for the UK as a whole. We often quite think in terms of monies coming from the CAP in terms of subsidies. And just let me a little note of caution here, because there could be challenges and opportunities in terms of where we may be heading in Brexit, is that the CAP itself was due for major reforms. It was being reformed. Brexit probably brings it a bit closer and a bit sooner than actually it would have been anticipated. But as I just note, the CAP was changing. But is the CAP about, in terms of, is it about funding and the funding of farmers and subsidies? We hear a lot about that. Or there's another dimension to this in terms of trade. Where would Northern Irish farmers be once the UK leaves the European Union? And one of my colleagues will talk to you a little bit later about various options that actually exist about where the UK could head. But the thing to note about most of those is agriculture isn't included in most of them. And the question is, where would the Northern Irish agriculture industry actually be once the UK leaves in terms of it fulfills Brexit? And these are real questions here in many ways. We all know that some of the models that are available, some will have some tariffs in place, others in many areas there'll be no tariffs. But do we need to think about these issues? Is there the idea that essentially the UK, thinking about a UK position in terms of where it may be in terms of trade and agriculture, is it looking for trade agreements? We know that Liam Fox actually is. He gets quite a bit of bad press. It certainly hasn't in the last week. But can he get trade agreements? What if he gets trade agreements with certain parts of the world like Latin America? Are there issues here in terms of access of agricultural goods to Northern Ireland we need to think about? That's one issue in terms of both the monies coming in, can the monies be replicated, should they be replicated after 2020? Also in terms of trade. But there are other issues here as well, and it's one of these ideas of what happens when Brexit actually occurs. In theory, what should happen is that agricultural policy as a devolved competence should then, once the UK leaves the European Union, should come down to the regional level, to Scotland, to Wales, to Northern Ireland. There are issues here. Will that actually happen? Will Whitehall suddenly step in at the last minute? But one of the questions that's sent here is the administrative capacity actually there, both in Whitehall, which you'll all be aware has lost X number of jobs in the last 5 years in restructuring and slimming down, but also Northern Ireland? Are the people there on the ground? Are the finances there actually on the ground? Or is there some mechanism within the UK that, again, for the executive to work at, how can it leverage more sort of funding mechanisms from the UK level? So other things to think about. And of course, some people also see this as a golden opportunity in terms, that is, Brexit as a golden opportunity to totally revamp farming and the idea move away from subsidies altogether. You'll have seen probably a month or so ago, the National Trust, which described itself as the biggest farmer in the UK, actually brought forward a proposal saying, actually, we should do away with all these subsidies, paying people for actually having land. And actually, because that doesn't really work. And what we should really do is think about actually paying them for looking after the countryside, bringing forward new environmental schemes. Now, that's radical in terms of ending subsidies, but it fits one of those issues about Brexit. There's various strands of Brexiteers, but one of them is that very much libertarian view. Let's actually get out there. I think that's part of the problem in all of this, is we still don't know. Time is moving very quickly, maybe too quickly. You almost feel... Do we feel a little bit we're sorry for Theresa May where she actually is? Does she need to wait longer than March 2017? Arguably she should, with the German elections coming up next year in the early autumn, and also the French elections a little bit earlier. But she doesn't. The political climate is for a speedier invoking of Article 50. So it raises questions about what this will actually look like for the UK and for Northern Ireland. I'm not going to go through the various figures in terms of the money's coming in through the various CAP, but I did think it was taking some of the quotes of some of those key individuals who were looking at what possibly could happen to the agricultural sector post-Brexit. And again, according to the head of the NFU, Brexit could devastate British farming. This was said after the Brexit vote. Described as a political car crash. And the danger for some of those people is what does this actually do for farming? Are farmers, and again, brings us back to Northern Ireland, but farms here tend to be smaller than the UK average. And this issue of how many of them might actually go to the wall in the process if there's a Brexit. So something else to think about. The issue of trying to look forward and suggesting what should happen, there's a whole host of questions to actually ask and then answer. And we don't have answers to all of them. But again, some of them come into play is, what happens to those, and there's estimated 40,000 legal acts linked to the CAP, what happens to them in terms of the UK statute book and then the statute book at the regional level? What does a British agriculture policy look like post-Brexit? Or is a Northern Irish agriculture policy different, to feed into Graham's earlier points about the agri-food sector? What does the Northern Ireland Executive think about all of this? Is it ready to actually administer a new agricultural policy? Funding mechanisms there at the place are there, of course. Will they be actually replicated? The border becomes a real issue here, and you'll hear more about that in the session after the break, about what does that mean for agriculture in terms of those goods that go back and forth to be processed, if there are some sort of barriers there, and of course, is it a challenge? Is it an opportunity? Is it a danger? The whole idea of smuggling, then, you'll see again really resurface again as things move across that border, which then raises another question again about how then do you police that border, try and deal with that. So how would also Northern Ireland, outside the EU, impact on the agricultural sector on the island of Ireland as a whole? So that cross-border dimension comes into play. Will agricultural goods be cheaper or more expensive after Brexit? It all depends on, well, who you might be, whether you might be exporting or actually importing. So a lot of the problems, I think, with looking forward, given that time is so tight, we need to very quickly, as a region, as a society, work out what is our take on some of these aspects. Agriculture is the example I actually am using here. So they're ready to actually move when those negotiations actually begin. Because those UK negotiations, I know you hear a lot about 2 years, take 2 years, they could possibly be done in 1 year. The actual divorce isn't going to be too much, isn't going to be the problem. It's then getting what's the new relationship with the EU going to be like, and also the new trading relationships with the rest of the world. That is the problem that has to be solved. But I'm going to pass on agriculture there and hand it to my colleague who's going to look at environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. So I'm going to talk about environment and mention the two words we haven't heard yet, soft Brexit and hard Brexit. Because when we're talking about the environment, these two very different scenarios really come into play, and we begin to understand why it could be so very different. So first thing to say when thinking about the environment is that membership of the European Union has radically changed how environment is governed in the UK. It's completely changed the type of policy and move toward more preventative policies underpinned by fixed standards, for example, in air quality, water quality, clear deadlines, but also principles like precaution, but also sustainability. All of this was not existing in UK law before, and there's a big question of what is going to happen now to the whole huge body of environmental legislation after Brexit. So what we've heard a lot now is about these two scenarios. One is a soft Brexit, in which the UK would remain as close as possible to the European Union by remaining in the European Economic Area, so it's also called the Norway option. On the complete opposite, you've got hard Brexit, with the UK trading with the EU under World Trade Organization rules, or perhaps having some kind of free trade agreement. For the environment, these two have radical, very, very different outcomes. For agriculture, it's actually the same outcome in that the cap doesn't apply in Norway either. So you have, in any case, you will have to come up with a new agricultural policy. But for the environment, most directives and regulations apply in Norway. That means if we go for a soft Brexit, most of the legislation stays the same. What does not stay the same is nature and conservation policies and the Bathing Water Directive, for example. So all that is birds and habitats, but also invasive alien, that would be removed. And that is quite critical for nature across GB, but also in Northern Ireland. So that means that if we go for a soft Brexit, this would be the area of environment that are perhaps most at risk, and on which we'll have to look more at whether policy is going up or down. What's, for example, interesting when you look at protected areas, UK protected areas are less protective of the environment than the Natura 2000 EU-wide framework. That means that if we remove these EU-level protection, you could much more easily build on protected areas, for example. So these would be areas of concern. Now, if you look to a hard Brexit, in many ways, all environmental policies are up for grab. And here it wouldn't necessarily be nature policies that would be most at risk, because you do have, across the UK, a very strong network of environmental NGOs, very strongly concerned citizens, and birds' habitats are things that matter to people. Waste, on the other hand, doesn't matter as much, is not as high in the kind of conscience in terms of environmental problems. And waste, as you well know, has been a long problem in Northern Ireland. So in that kind of hard Brexit, you could have lots of problems of waste management and relaxation of rules. Now, these, in many ways, are a UK-wide problem, where you see, as Graham said before, magnified UK-wide issues in Northern Ireland, is perhaps in the administrative capacity issues that arise from looking at the environment. If you have to come up with new environmental policies, if you have to come up with new agricultural policies in general, that will put a huge pressure on the administrative sector. Do we have enough people to do it? Now, in many ways, for agriculture and the environment, it's a UK-wide problem. We know, for example, that DEFRA has lost 2/3 of its staff in the last decade. So, of course, if you've got 2/3 of less person to deal with creating new agricultural and new environmental policies, it's going to be a problem. But in some ways, DEFRA has had for a long time, still has contributed a lot to creating these policies. It's not sure that executive in Northern Ireland have had that much input. So you will have to come up and to understand how you create these policies from the bottom up. But you also have problems that are specific to Northern Ireland in many ways. There's a question of coordination and collaboration. Now, across the GB, you've got increasing demands for, if we remove this umbrella EU-wide policy, we need to replace it by an umbrella UK-wide policy. That's a proposal by lots of environmental NGOs. The idea is to try to avoid a race to the bottom, but also to try to limit the kind of divergence in policies. Because for now, what we have is environmental directives by the European Union that are implemented differently in Wales, in England, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland. If you remove that common EU rule, and what you have is no more common rules and just devolved matter, and all of the different devolved administration could go in very different ways. This could be very good, this could be very bad, and most NGOs agree that we should have a common rule. Because the idea is then to try to avoid too much divergence. Of course, that's all very good, but that would require, it's a huge legal challenge, because in many ways that would require to go back into the devolution agreements. But the problem is, of course, when you look at Northern Ireland, is that the coordination and collaboration would not just be necessary for the environment with the rest of, with GB, but with the Republic of Ireland. Of course, when you have shared water management, for example, river basins that are transboundary, if you apply different rules on both sides, that will be very complicated. So then you have this perhaps great opportunity to create new policies, but at the same time, if there's a big divergence between what is done in the north and in the south of Ireland, you will have lots of big potential problems for the environment. Think of waste management again, but again, think also of invasive species. If you've got very different approaches in the south and in the north, then you won't have coordination. You have perhaps lots of problems with invasive species. Okay, so in many ways, the environment is a good way of looking into challenges that will apply across the board to so many other policies as well. It really shows that the type of agreement, the type of divorce that the EU and UK negotiates will have very detailed policy impact that will really depend on the minuteness of the deal. And that in many ways Northern Ireland, because of its border, will have very different challenges in terms of coordination and coordination with whom, very different from what GB has. And this will have to be taken into consideration moving forward. I think that was all I had to say. Thank you very much.